Long before the medals and the desert campaigns, he was just Erwin, a quiet, curious boy from Heidenheim. No war hero, no prodigy, just the son of a schoolteacher building wooden gliders behind his house and staring past the rooftops toward something bigger. Germany was an empire built on order, tradition, and military pride, but Rommel didn't come from a military family. What he had was instinct, discipline, and a stubborn belief that he didn't need a noble name to wear a uniform. Erwin Rommel's early years in Heidenheim, a quiet town in southern Germany, painted a picture of modest beginnings. Born in 1891, Rommel's family wasn't aristocratic or wealthy. His father, a teacher, was dedicated to his work, but was not the type to instill military aspirations. Rommel's mother, however, supported his dreams more openly. Even as a child, Erwin displayed a fierce independence and a sense of restlessness that stood out from the other children. While others were content with their rural lives, Rommel was already looking beyond the horizon, dreaming of something bigger. Heidenheim, with its small streets and unassuming landscape, hardly seemed the birthplace of a military legend. But Rommel's environment was not just shaped by his town. It was influenced by the larger military culture in Germany. The Prussian military traditions, still a significant part of German life, were in the air. Despite his humble beginnings, Rommel felt a deep, almost inexplicable calling to the military life. He admired soldiers and dreamt of wearing the uniform, an ambition that was clearly at odds with his family's intellectual and quiet lifestyle. As Rommel grew, he began to challenge the expectations placed on him. His father, Friedrich, was skeptical of Rommel's desire to join the military. Rommel's inclination for battle was seen as a fleeting fantasy, something that would eventually pass. But Rommel's persistence was unwavering. While his peers often studied books, Rommel focused on physical activities and military strategy. He became fascinated with military tactics, reading books about war and soldiers. For him, the idea of a military life was more than just a profession. It was a calling, something that defined his very identity. His relationship with his father remained somewhat strained as Rommel's obsession with military life grew. Though his father loved him, he could not understand his son's obsession with war. Friedrich had seen the destruction and the toll of war during his own lifetime. He felt the need to protect his son from the harsh realities of a soldier's life. But Rommel's passion was stronger than any opposition. Even from a young age, Erwin felt an urgency to prove himself, to show that his dreams were not childish fantasies. At 18, Rommel made his move. He applied to the Stuttgart Military Academy, an important institution for those seeking to enter the officer class in Germany. While his peers were often the sons of wealthy families, Rommel did not come from such background. His modest roots presented an obstacle in the elitist military system. But his application was driven by a sense of urgency, as though he felt time was running out to prove himself. The prospect of joining the military was not just an opportunity. It was his only way of proving his worth. He faced rejection initially. Many military institutions were selective, and Rommel's social status worked against him. But Rommel did not relent. His persistence eventually paid off when he was accepted into the Stuttgart Academy in 1910. Despite not coming from the right background, Rommel impressed his peers and instructors with his physical prowess and leadership skills. He was not the best academically, but his strategic thinking and physical endurance set him apart. From the moment he stepped onto the academy grounds, Rommel was determined to carve a path of his own. In his early years at the academy, Rommel often felt out of place. His classmates were from families with long-standing military traditions, and many of them had superior academic backgrounds. However, Rommel's focus was on the physical and practical side of military training. His classmates noticed his confidence and tenacity, and despite initial reservations, Rommel began to develop a reputation. He was quickly recognized for his unconventional approach to military training, an approach that would later define his career on the battlefield. Rommel's early days at Stuttgart revealed the core of his character, his resilience. Although many around him came from families that could afford to send them to prestigious schools, Rommel had to fight for every inch of recognition. His background made him more determined to prove himself. He did not believe in shortcuts or relying on others. Rommel's journey was about creating his own path, not following in the footsteps of those before him. In the classroom, Rommel struggled with the traditional, theoretical military tactics that most students excelled in. But he thrived in practical exercises, where he could put his theories into action. His instructors, though initially skeptical, began to notice his unconventional thinking and leadership qualities. Rommel demonstrated an understanding of military strategy that far surpassed what was taught in books. The fact that he had no aristocratic background may have made him stand out negatively at first, but it soon became evident that he had what it took to rise above the others. Despite the difficulties he faced, Rommel graduated from the Stuttgart Military Academy in 1911, ready to embark on his military career. The academy had equipped him with basic military knowledge, but more importantly, it had taught him how to think outside the box. Rommel wasn't just an officer who would follow orders. He was a man who would one day lead men, relying not just on the traditions of the past, but on his own creative genius. Rommel's decision to join the military wasn't just about following a path laid out by tradition or expectation. For him, it was a way of life. The idea of becoming a soldier was the only future he could imagine. At the time, the German military was one of the most respected in Europe, and for Rommel, the prospect of becoming part of that tradition was almost a personal duty. But joining wasn't easy for someone without noble birth or a high-class pedigree. It meant fighting through barriers that many others would never face. Still, Rommel wasn't daunted. His time at the Stuttgart Military Academy became a formative experience. While others spent their time focusing on theory and tradition, Rommel was always more hands-on. He threw himself into practical training, constantly pushing his limits. His classmates were often from wealthier families, but Rommel's tenacity and natural leadership skills made him a standout. As a result, he quickly rose to a position of leadership in the academy, despite not having the aristocratic connections of many of his fellow students. His abilities on the field and his leadership in military exercises quickly gained him the respect of his peers. Despite this recognition, Rommel's decision to join the military came with a sense of urgency. He wasn't just joining for the prestige or the uniform. He was driven by a profound desire to prove that he had what it took to rise to the top in a system that often favored the privileged. He understood that to succeed in the military world, he would have to constantly challenge the system, push against the walls that society and class had erected. This drive would follow him throughout his career. At the time, the world was on the brink of war, and Rommel knew that the coming conflict would offer him the chance to prove his worth. But even before World War I began, Rommel had begun studying military strategy. He pored over books, learning about past conflicts and strategies that had worked in the field. He became obsessed with tactics, often thinking about what made certain generals successful. His early military experiences reinforced the idea that true leadership wasn't just about orders. It was about ingenuity and the ability to read the situation on the ground. Rommel's devotion to military life wasn't purely intellectual. It was deeply emotional. Every decision he made, every moment of his life, seemed to push him toward this goal. He felt an innate desire to prove that he could achieve what others thought impossible. His passion was rooted in a belief that military life could offer him more than just a career. It was a way to assert his identity. Rommel was not content to be just another officer. He sought to be one of the best, and this drive would define him for the rest of his life. By 1912, Rommel had successfully joined the German military, despite his lack of noble birth. This was just the beginning of a long journey. As Rommel advanced in rank, he became more aware of the importance of his choices. Each decision he made was an investment in his future, not just as a soldier, but as someone who would one day make a significant impact on military history. But this journey was not without challenges. The military system was strict and hierarchical, and Rommel would often find himself in situations where he had to prove his worth against those with more traditional backgrounds. Joining the military was the first step in Rommel's long journey toward leadership. It would be in the next phase of his career, however, that he would truly begin to emerge as a strategist. In the early days, Rommel was often forced to learn the rules of the military system just to survive. But as he progressed, his innovative thinking began to shine through. Rommel was a natural leader, and in time, he would use this ability to push himself to the front lines of battle. Rommel's desire to prove himself would lead him to some of the most dangerous battles of his life. His relentless commitment to military life would take him to the front lines of World War I, where his skills would finally be put to the ultimate test. But that journey began in the quiet town of Heidenheim and would evolve over the course of his early military career. Joining the military was just the first step in a life that would forever change history. Rommel's early military career was far from glamorous. He was assigned to the infantry, where he learned that being an officer was far more demanding than he had imagined. The German military system was strict, and he quickly understood that rising through the ranks wouldn't come easily. Despite his natural talents, Rommel often found himself up against a system that favored aristocratic families and long-established military traditions. It would take more than just skill and determination to rise above the system. Rommel's first years in the military were a period of personal growth and struggle. He learned quickly that there was a rigid hierarchy within the German military, one that wasn't necessarily based on merit. Although Rommel was highly intelligent and talented, he had to fight for every inch of recognition. He found it difficult to accept the bureaucracy and inefficiencies of the military system, which often placed obstacles in the way of those who weren't born into privilege. Despite these challenges, Rommel's rise was not a slow one. His early assignments, though often routine, allowed him to showcase his leadership ability. His soldiers quickly realized that Rommel was a different kind of officer. Unlike many of his superiors, he didn't just bark orders from behind a desk. Rommel led from the front, always willing to risk his own life alongside his men. This earned him their respect and loyalty, which was crucial in a military environment where trust was often hard to come by. His reputation for taking risks and leading with courage soon reached the higher-ups in the military. Rommel wasn't the traditional officer who followed orders to the letter. He was a man of action who was always looking for ways to improve the performance of his troops. His ability to adapt and think on his feet set him apart from others. As his reputation grew, Rommel began to get noticed by senior officers who saw potential in him. He began to rise in the ranks, slowly but steadily, earning himself a place among the officers who would go on to shape the future of the military. By the time World War I began in 1914, Rommel had already proven his capabilities on the battlefield. His leadership in the early skirmishes caught the attention of his superiors. They saw that Rommel was not only capable of leading, but that he had a unique understanding of military tactics. He could quickly read a battlefield, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of both his forces and the enemy. This insight would be critical in the battles to come, where Rommel would soon be thrust into one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. Despite the horrors of war, Rommel was able to maintain his focus. He didn't become hardened or numb to the destruction around him. Instead, he grew more determined to make a difference, to prove that he could be a leader not just in name, but through action. His early experiences in World War I would go on to define him, not only as a leader, but as a man who would go on to defy the traditional boundaries of warfare. Rommel's early career in World War I was a time of trial and error. He learned from his mistakes and used them to improve his leadership style. He developed a keen sense of strategy, focusing on speed and flexibility, rather than the rigid tactics that were common at the time. His success on the battlefield was not just due to his technical expertise, but because of his ability to think on his feet and adapt to changing circumstances. Through it all, Rommel remained a student of warfare. He studied every battle he encountered, learning from both his victories and his losses. His success was not just about his ability to command troops, but about his constant evolution as a tactician. By the end of World War I, Rommel had established himself as one of Germany's brightest military minds. The early struggles Rommel faced in his military career were the foundation for his future successes. They gave him the resilience and determination needed to become one of history's most renowned military leaders. His ability to learn from adversity and his unique approach to battle would set him apart from his contemporaries and lay the groundwork for his legendary career. In 1941, the desert stretched out before Erwin Rommel, a world so harsh and unforgiving that only the toughest men could survive it. He arrived in North Africa as part of the German Africa Corps, sent to assist the faltering Italian forces in Libya. The mission seemed almost impossible. Germany was already embroiled in battles across Europe, and the British forces controlled much of North Africa. But Rommel saw this as an opportunity, not just to fight, but to prove himself on a different kind of battlefield. The barren land of the Sahara, with its endless dunes and searing heat, would soon become his stage. Rommel's arrival was marked by a quiet determination. He quickly assessed the situation, recognizing that the Italians were poorly prepared and lacked the leadership to mount an effective defense against the British. Rommel didn't waste time complaining about the lack of resources or the ill-equipped troops under his command. Instead, he set to work with the precision of a craftsman, pulling together a plan to strike swiftly and decisively. His experience in the trenches of World War I had taught him that speed and surprise were the most powerful weapons in war, and it was in North Africa that he would put this philosophy to the ultimate test. By the end of the year, the first signs of Rommel's brilliance were becoming clear. His unorthodox strategies caught the British off guard, and soon he was seen as the new face of the German military in the desert. He wasn't just another general following orders. Rommel was a force of nature, and it wasn't long before his name was whispered with both fear and admiration. The Battle of Gazala, fought in May and June of 1942, was a defining moment for Rommel and his Africa Corps. It was here that his tactical genius would shine brightest. The British forces, under the command of General Claude Auchinleck, were confident that their superior numbers and defenses would allow them to hold the line. But Rommel had a different plan. Rather than attacking head-on in a traditional fashion, he used deception, misdirection, and his well-trained mobile forces to create confusion among the British. Rommel's approach was swift and relentless. He used his tanks and infantry in lightning-fast raids, striking where the British least expected it. His most brilliant move came when he feigned a retreat, drawing the British into a trap before launching a counterattack that would take them by surprise. The British forces, unable to respond quickly enough, were forced to retreat. Rommel's victory at Gazala was not just a military triumph, it was a psychological one as well. He had outsmarted the British, and his reputation as the Desert Fox was solidified. The title, coined by the British soldiers themselves, wasn't just a nickname. It was a recognition of Rommel's uncanny ability to adapt and thrive in the harshest of conditions. As Rommel pressed forward, he knew that Gazala was just the beginning. The British had been humiliated and their confidence had been shattered. Rommel now stood poised to advance further into British-held territory with the ultimate goal of securing Egypt and its vital Suez Canal, a crucial lifeline for the Allies. Rommel's next target was the heavily fortified port city of Tobruk, a British stronghold that had withstood months of attacks. It was a symbol of British resilience in North Africa, and its capture would be a significant blow to the Allied war effort. For Rommel, it was a test of his mettle. The city's defenses were formidable, but Rommel was undeterred. He understood that the key to victory was not brute force, but finding weaknesses in the enemy's defenses and exploiting them. In early June of 1942, after several weeks of intense fighting, Rommel's forces surrounded Tobruk. The British, having suffered heavy casualties and running low on supplies, were forced to surrender. It was a stunning victory, one that sent shockwaves through the British leadership and bolstered Rommel's reputation. In one decisive strike, he had captured over 30,000 prisoners and secured a critical supply port. Tobruk's fall marked the apex of Rommel's North African campaign. With the victory at Tobruk, Rommel's momentum grew. His next move was toward Egypt, and specifically, the strategic city of El Alamein, which stood as the last major obstacle before he could march into the heart of Allied territory. As Rommel's forces advanced, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The British, led by General Bernard Montgomery, were preparing for a counterattack. Rommel knew the battle to come would be a defining moment, not just for him, but for the entire war in North Africa. By now, Rommel's mythos had become larger than life. The name Desert Fox was known not only by the Allies, but also by his own soldiers. To them, Rommel was more than just a commander. He was a symbol of hope and skill in the face of overwhelming odds. His presence on the battlefield inspired a fierce loyalty among his men, and his reputation for leading from the front, often riding alongside his soldiers, earned him their respect and admiration. But it wasn't just his own troops who were impressed. British soldiers, though bitter enemies, also held a grudging respect for Rommel. They saw him as a formidable opponent, a man who could think on his feet and adapt to any situation. His reputation was so powerful that, even in defeat, he was considered a hero. British officers would later admit that they feared Rommel's presence more than that of any other German general. Rommel's ability to lead in the face of adversity, his swift and effective tactics, and his relentless pursuit of victory became the stuff of legend. His mythos grew not just from his victories, but from the way he conducted himself, always calm, always calculating. He became a symbol of a new kind of warfare, one that valued mobility and ingenuity over traditional tactics. For both allies and enemies alike, Rommel was a name that would be remembered long after the war ended. In the early years of the Nazi regime, Erwin Rommel, like many Germans, saw Adolf Hitler as the savior of their shattered nation. Germany had been left in ruins after World War I, crippled by economic turmoil and political instability. Hitler promised to restore Germany's pride and power. Rommel, a soldier who had lived through the horrors of the Great War, saw in Hitler a leader who could revive his homeland. The charismatic speeches, the promise of a new Germany, and the wave of nationalistic pride were impossible to ignore. For Rommel, Hitler's rise represented a chance for Germany to reclaim its strength on the world stage. The early years of Nazi rule brought some measure of hope, as the economy improved and the country started to rebuild. Rommel admired the way Hitler had united the people, giving them a sense of purpose and direction. At first, Rommel saw only the strength in Hitler's vision, believing that the Führer's goals were aligned with the future of Germany. The dark side of the regime, the racism, the violence, and the repression, was still hidden beneath the surface for Rommel, just as it was for many of his fellow officers. But Rommel was no fool. He wasn't blind to the political shifts and changes in Germany, especially as the Nazis began consolidating power. Still, his admiration for Hitler's early victories and the apparent prosperity of Germany kept him firmly within the fold of the regime. Rommel, a soldier above all, viewed the situation through a military lens. Germany needed strength to survive. He wasn't yet willing to question the morality of the regime. However, as time passed, the cracks in the Nazi facade would begin to show. As the war dragged on, Rommel began to see more of the regime's true nature. The victories that had seemed so promising at first were soon overshadowed by the horrors that accompanied them. The conquest of Europe brought with it the brutal occupation of countries, and Rommel found himself in places where Nazi ideology was put into practice in the most violent of ways. The treatment of Jews and civilians in occupied territories was something he could no longer ignore. He began to hear whispers about the atrocities being committed by the SS, and what he heard troubled him deeply. Rommel was a man of honor, and the brutalities of the regime conflicted with his sense of decency. His growing unease was magnified when he witnessed firsthand the ruthless methods employed by the Nazis. He had long believed in the honor of soldiers and the need to protect civilians from the horrors of war. But the orders coming from higher up were different. They encouraged terror and cruelty, something Rommel could not reconcile with his personal values. Rommel was a military strategist, not a politician, and at first he tried to push aside the moral dilemmas. But as the war went on, it became harder for him to remain indifferent. The execution of prisoners, the massacres of civilians, the scorched earth tactics, all of these practices were part of the war that Hitler's regime was waging. Rommel's discomfort grew, but he was a soldier first, and for a long time, he kept his misgivings to himself. His growing disillusionment wasn't just a matter of morality, it was also about leadership. Rommel had always been a man who believed in leading by example, in fighting for the good of his soldiers and his country. But as he rose higher in the ranks, he found himself working under leaders who were more interested in maintaining power and furthering Nazi ideology than in fighting for Germany's survival. It became clear to Rommel that Hitler's goals went far beyond restoring national pride. They were about total domination, and that was something Rommel could not accept. Rommel's internal conflict came to a head when he was asked to carry out orders that contradicted everything he believed in. One of the most significant moments in his growing resistance came when he was ordered to execute prisoners of war, British soldiers captured during one of his campaigns. The Nazis had a brutal policy of execution, hoping to deter the enemy, but Rommel couldn't bring himself to follow through. He knew that executing prisoners was not only a violation of international law, but it was also a betrayal of the very principles that made him a soldier. This was just one of many orders Rommel refused to carry out. He had seen enough to know that the war was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the soul of Germany. But Rommel was no fool. He understood the consequences of defying the Führer. As much as he hated the ideology, he still valued loyalty and duty. He tried to find ways to work within the system while subtly undermining the more extreme orders. He began to distance himself from the SS, who were tasked with carrying out the most heinous atrocities, and to push back against their influence within the military. Rommel's refusal to carry out certain orders did not go unnoticed. His actions were a quiet form of rebellion, a refusal to turn a blind eye to the horrors of the regime. Though he was still loyal to Germany, his growing disillusionment made him an outsider in his own army. His willingness to question the regime made him a threat to the very structure he had sworn to protect. But he wasn't the only one questioning Hitler's orders. There were whispers of resistance within the ranks, and Rommel's discontentment was shared by others in the military. His defiance didn't just signal his own internal struggle, it was a reflection of the wider cracks forming within the Nazi war machine. Rommel's growing disillusionment was not only with Hitler, but also with the men around him. The Nazi officers who carried out the regime's policies with brutal efficiency. While Rommel remained a soldier at heart, he could not ignore the difference between him and the men who had risen through the ranks due to their allegiance to the Nazi Party. Many of the officers Rommel interacted with were more interested in advancing their own careers than fighting for the survival of Germany. Their loyalty to Hitler was absolute, and they showed little regard for the values that Rommel held dear. Rommel's disdain for the SS grew as he witnessed the atrocities they committed in the occupied territories. Their methods were alien to him. They cared little for military honor and far more about achieving Hitler's vision of a world ruled by Nazi ideology. Rommel, however, found himself at odds with this vision. His focus was always on strategy, on winning battles through skill and intelligence, not through terror and bloodshed. As the war progressed, he realized that Hitler's regime was focused on much more than just winning. It was about creating a world order based on hate and conquest. Rommel's disillusionment with the officers around him deepened as he saw the lack of honor in the Nazi high command. Despite his growing discontent, Rommel knew that he could not simply walk away from his duties. He was still a soldier, and his role was to serve Germany, even if he disagreed with the leadership. But the more he saw of the regime's cruelty, the more he realized that his time in Hitler's military was drawing to a close. The relationship between Rommel and the Nazi officers grew colder as he withdrew further into himself, questioning the legitimacy of his service to a regime that had become increasingly tyrannical. By 1944, the war was turning in favor of the Allies, and Hitler's once mighty Reich was beginning to crumble. Rommel, who had always been a soldier first, found himself caught between his duty to Germany and his growing disillusionment with the man who had led the nation into ruin. For years, Rommel had been uncomfortable with the direction of the war and the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. But now, with the situation in Europe becoming increasingly dire, his conscience could no longer remain silent. In the months leading up to the failed July 20th assassination attempt, Rommel became aware of the German resistance. He had long suspected that not everyone in Germany was blind to the horrors of the regime. But it was only now that he realized just how deep the opposition ran. The plot to overthrow Hitler was no longer just a distant rumor. It was becoming a reality, with key members of the military and government joining forces to end the Führer's reign of terror. For Rommel, the idea of rebellion was a difficult one. He was a soldier, bound by duty and honor, and he had always held loyalty above all else. Yet, as the war progressed and the truth of Hitler's madness became undeniable, Rommel could no longer ignore the reality of what was happening to his country. As Rommel learned more about the resistance movement, he felt both fear and relief. He was terrified by the risks involved. Participating in the plot was nothing short of treason. But at the same time, he felt a growing sense of responsibility. The war was lost, Germany was being torn apart, and if something wasn't done soon, the country would be destroyed. Rommel began to understand that the only way to save Germany from complete collapse was to remove Hitler from power. But the line between loyalty to his country and loyalty to the regime was no longer clear. The man who had led Germany to war was now the very reason the nation was on the brink of ruin. As Rommel became more involved in the resistance movement, his role shifted from one of reluctant observer to active participant. Despite his reservations, he eventually agreed to support the plot to kill Hitler, though he did so with great caution. Rommel had no desire to take up arms against his own countrymen, but he knew that the alternative was far worse. He didn't want to be the man who sat idly by while the country he loved was destroyed from within. His involvement was, however, fraught with complexity. Rommel did not want to be a central figure in the conspiracy, and at first, he remained a somewhat distant figurehead. He met with resistance leaders in secret, listening more than speaking, trying to understand the depth of their plans, while still keeping a low profile. Rommel was no stranger to deception and military strategy, but this was different. This was about betraying the very government he had sworn to serve. His participation was calculated, and he knew that if the plot failed, the consequences would be catastrophic not only for him, but for everyone involved. Rommel's role, however, was crucial. He was a popular and respected figure, especially among the German soldiers who admired his tactical brilliance. His support, even if it was passive, gave the resistance movement a sense of legitimacy. Rommel wasn't just a general in the army. He was a symbol of military honor and leadership. His endorsement, however reluctant, made it clear that the plot had the support of some of the highest-ranking officers in Germany's military. Yet, even as he moved closer to the resistance, Rommel remained uncertain. He was walking a tightrope, torn between his duty as a soldier and the realization that he might be Germany's last hope for survival. The plot reached its climax on July 20th, 1944, when a group of high-ranking conspirators attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The plan was to plant a bomb at the meeting, but a series of mishaps prevented the assassination from succeeding. The bomb went off, but Hitler survived, only slightly injured. The failed attempt was a devastating blow to the resistance and to Rommel, who had been supporting the conspiracy from behind the scenes. The failure of the assassination attempt set off a brutal wave of reprisals across Germany. Hitler, enraged by the plot, ordered a sweeping crackdown, with thousands of suspected conspirators arrested and executed. Rommel, though not directly implicated in the assassination attempt, found himself at the center of a storm. He was now seen as a traitor by the Nazi regime, and the Gestapo was closing in on him. Rommel's once illustrious career as the Desert Fox had made him a target of the very regime he had once served. Rommel was not unaware of the risk he was taking. He knew that, despite his popularity and military status, his involvement in the plot would lead to his downfall. As the net closed around him, he faced an impossible choice: suicide or public execution. To his credit, Rommel never considered surrendering. He had defied Hitler's regime, and now it seemed there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. His involvement in the plot made it clear that he had become a marked man. Rommel's fate was sealed in the days following the failed assassination attempt. The Gestapo had gathered enough evidence to implicate him in the plot, and Rommel's involvement was no longer deniable. As the authorities closed in, he was summoned to meet with senior Nazi officials, who gave him a grim ultimatum: face trial, be publicly humiliated, and watch as his family was destroyed, or take his own life. Rommel's decision was not made lightly, but he knew that for the sake of his family and his legacy, the only option was to end his life. On October 14, 1944, Rommel took cyanide and died quietly at his home in Herrlingen, Germany. His death was presented to the public as the result of injuries sustained in a car accident during the previous year, but the truth was far more sinister. Rommel's tragic end was a direct result of his defiance against Hitler's regime. The man who had once been celebrated as a military genius and a hero of the German people had become a victim of the very ideology he had once served. Rommel's final days were filled with immense pressure. He knew the consequences of his actions, and yet he could not back down. The trauma of seeing his country torn apart by war, his disillusionment with the Nazis, and the knowledge that his own life would end in shame all weighed heavily on him. Despite his legacy as a brilliant strategist, Rommel's end was as tragic as it was inevitable. He had been caught between two worlds: his loyalty to his country and his growing contempt for the man who had led it to ruin. In the end, his defiance was both his strength and his downfall. After Rommel's death, the German public was left in turmoil, trying to make sense of the man they had once hailed as a hero. Officially, the Nazis tried to downplay his involvement in the July 20th plot, claiming he had died from complications after a car accident. But rumors about his true fate spread like wildfire, and many Germans, still reeling from the war's devastation, saw Rommel in a different light. To them, he was a martyr, a man who had fought valiantly for his country, and even in the face of impending defeat, tried to break away from Hitler's grip on Germany. Rommel's death represented a sacrifice, one that symbolized the tragic cost of the war, and for many, he became the last figure of German military honor in a time when the country was facing utter destruction. For the common German soldier, Rommel was not just a general, he was a symbol of leadership. Rommel was known for caring about his soldiers, and he fought alongside them, often enduring the same hardships and risks. He wasn't just a man issuing commands from a distance. He was a figure who shared the dangers of battle with his men. This aspect of his leadership made him beloved among the troops. In their eyes, Rommel embodied a form of honor and duty that went beyond the orders of a dictator. The myth of Rommel as a protector of Germany's honor was born here. with the soldiers who admired him and the civilians who clung to his memory as a reminder of a Germany that was once strong and proud. However, as the war came to a close and Germany was occupied by the Allies, a darker narrative began to emerge. Some Germans began to question whether Rommel had truly been the patriot they had believed him to be. Had he merely been trying to save himself and his family from the consequences of his association with the Nazi regime? Or had he been a reluctant resistor who had waited too long to act? These questions sparked debates across Germany. Some continued to see him as a martyr, someone who had died for his country and stood against Hitler when it mattered most. Others wondered if Rommel had been complicit in the horrors of the regime, only belatedly seeing the evil around him as the war began to turn. The German people's reaction to Rommel's death was deeply mixed. To some, he was an icon of German military greatness, a symbol of the good soldier who had fought honorably even when the war had clearly been lost. To others, he was a tragic figure, a man who had been trapped in the web of a madman's vision, never fully breaking free from his ties to the Nazi regime. These conflicting perceptions only grew more complicated as the years passed, and Rommel's involvement in the resistance became more widely known. His death was viewed as both a tragic end to a brilliant career and a sad testament to the failed promise of Nazi Germany. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Rommel's myth began to take on a life of its own. His death was a rallying point for those who wanted to distance themselves from the Nazis, but still hold on to some semblance of German pride. Rommel became a figure who embodied the idea that not all Germans had been complicit in the horrors of the Third Reich. For many, he was a symbol of what Germany could have been, a country that fought with honor, not one that engaged in the atrocities that followed Hitler's rise to power. However, this idealized image would slowly evolve as historians dug deeper into Rommel's actions during the war. As Germany slowly rebuilt itself in the post-war years, Rommel's legacy was re-examined in both a positive and negative light. His supporters continued to view him as a reluctant hero, someone who resisted Hitler even though he never publicly denounced the regime. Critics, on the other hand, argued that Rommel's reluctance to completely break from the Nazis, his hesitation to speak out publicly against Hitler, left a stain on his legacy. As the debate raged on, Rommel's image shifted, no longer the simple symbol of resistance, but a more nuanced figure caught between loyalty to his country and the realities of the Nazi war machine. While Rommel's image in Germany was complex, his reputation abroad, particularly among the Allies, was more straightforward. Despite the brutal conflict, Rommel was widely respected by the British and other Allied forces for his military genius. He was seen as a formidable opponent, one whose tactical brilliance on the battlefield made him a figure to be admired, even feared. His campaigns in North Africa were a testament to his ability to outmaneuver and surprise larger, better-equipped enemy forces. Rommel's reputation grew with each victory, and by the time the war reached its peak, he had become one of the most well-known figures in military history, even among those who fought against him. British soldiers and officers alike admired Rommel's military skills and the way he conducted warfare. His tactics at Gazala and Tobruk became legendary. His understanding of the desert terrain and his ability to use speed and surprise to outflank and overwhelm his enemies were unparalleled. Even in defeat, Rommel commanded respect. He was not the type of general to sit behind the lines and issue orders from a safe distance. Instead, he often led his forces from the front, sharing in the hardships of battle alongside his men. This earned him admiration from those who fought against him, as they recognized the courage and strategic insight he brought to every campaign. Despite the admiration, the British and many other allies understood that Rommel's genius was being used in service of a regime that represented everything they were fighting against. His brilliance on the battlefield was undeniable, but it came at a heavy cost. Rommel's leadership was embedded within a war machine that sought to conquer Europe, enslave nations, and perpetuate the horrors of the Holocaust. For the Allies, this was a paradox, a man of honor who fought for a cause of tyranny and terror. Rommel's tactical acumen could not erase the reality of the political ideology he was upholding. As the war progressed and Rommel's involvement in the assassination attempt on Hitler became known, his reputation with the Allies shifted again. While they respected his military prowess, they began to see Rommel as more than just a soldier fighting for his country. They saw him as a man caught in a moral dilemma, one who had come to realize that the war was lost and Hitler's regime had to be stopped. In this context, Rommel was viewed as a tragic figure, someone who fought not just for victory, but to prevent the ultimate destruction of Germany. The respect for his military achievements was coupled with a recognition that he had, in the end, made a stand against the tyranny of the regime. Though Rommel never fully escaped the stain of his association with Nazi Germany, his admiration among the Allies remained relatively intact. Many of his former adversaries acknowledged the depth of his skill as a strategist and the dignity with which he fought, even though they understood the complexities of his position. Rommel was a man who had faced the harshest of choices, one who had seen the darker side of war and in the end tried to prevent even greater suffering. This made him an even more compelling figure, one whose legacy would continue to spark discussion and debate for generations. Even after the war, Rommel's reputation as a military genius remained untarnished among military scholars and tacticians. His use of mobile warfare, his focus on speed, surprise, and adaptability were still viewed as cornerstones of modern warfare. His ability to lead his forces under the harshest of conditions, through desert terrain against overwhelming odds, was celebrated and studied by military leaders around the world. Rommel was respected not only by the men who had fought beside him, but by those who had fought against him. His legacy, however complicated, ensured that he would be remembered as one of the greatest military minds of the 20th century. As time passed, the debate surrounding Rommel's true intentions only intensified. Was he a Nazi sympathizer, too wrapped up in the machine of war to realize the true nature of Hitler's regime? Or was he a reluctant resistor, a man who realized too late that Germany was being led to ruin and tried in his own way to stop it? Historians continue to argue these points, and the ambiguity surrounding Rommel's character makes him one of the most debated figures of the Second World War. Rommel's early admiration for Hitler and his unquestioning loyalty to Germany's military ambitions during the war complicates any definitive judgment. For years, he served as a high-ranking officer in Hitler's army, a man who fought and led the Nazi war effort. To some, this makes it difficult to reconcile his later resistance against the regime. How could someone who had been so involved in the Nazi war machine suddenly turn against the very system he had helped to build? These critics argue that Rommel's reluctance to speak out against the atrocities of the Nazis, or to fully break away from Hitler's influence, undermines any claim to resistance. On the other hand, there are those who believe that Rommel's actions during the war indicate a man who was caught between duty and conscience. They argue that Rommel did not support Hitler's ideology, but rather served out of duty to Germany and his soldiers. His willingness to entertain the idea of overthrowing Hitler, even at great personal risk, points to a man who recognized the damage that Hitler's rule was causing. His attempts to protect civilians and his refusal to carry out some of the regime's more brutal orders suggest a man who struggled with the moral implications of his actions and sought a way to prevent further bloodshed. The problem with Rommel's legacy lies in the timing of his moral awakening. He had been a loyal soldier of the Third Reich for much of the war, and only in its dying days did he begin to question Hitler's leadership. Historians who view Rommel as a reluctant resistor argue that his failure to act sooner means his role in the resistance, though significant, was ultimately too late. Others, however, see his later attempts to undermine Hitler as proof that he was a man of conscience, someone who chose to act even when the cost was his life. The debate continues, and it is unlikely that any single conclusion will ever fully capture the complexity of Rommel's character. Some historians assert that Rommel's true loyalty was to his country, not the Nazi regime. They argue that he was simply a soldier caught in a terrible situation, one in which loyalty to Germany was in conflict with loyalty to the Führer. They point to his defiance of Nazi orders, his attempts to limit the violence in occupied territories, and his growing disillusionment with Hitler as evidence of a man trying to navigate a moral minefield. To them, Rommel was neither a hero nor a traitor. He was a man struggling with the moral complexities of war and leadership in an era dominated by tyranny. Despite the controversy surrounding Rommel's political stance, there is no denying his lasting impact on military strategy. His reputation as a military genius has only grown in the years since his death. Rommel's approach to warfare, especially his use of mobile warfare, his understanding of terrain, and his ability to execute fast, decisive attacks, changed the way wars were fought. He was a master at using the environment to his advantage, and his campaigns in North Africa remain a model for military tacticians around the world. Rommel's ability to outmaneuver his enemies, often against overwhelming odds, made him a formidable force. His leadership was characterized by a deep understanding of his soldiers' needs, a quality that earned him their loyalty and respect. He led from the front, sharing the hardships of his men, and made tactical decisions that were often years ahead of his time. His strategies at Gazala, Tobruk, and El Alamein are still studied by military professionals for their brilliance and ingenuity. Rommel's legacy as a strategist remains one of the most enduring aspects of his career. Rommel's influence extended far beyond the battlefields of North Africa. His principles of warfare, speed, surprise, and adaptability became hallmarks of modern military doctrine. His tactical innovations, such as the use of tanks and infantry in coordination to strike quickly and decisively, helped shape the future of warfare. Even decades after his death, Rommel's ideas continue to influence military leaders and are often cited in military academies around the world. His impact on military theory is immeasurable, and his contributions have been incorporated into various military strategies, both by the Allies and adversaries. Yet, Rommel's genius was ultimately intertwined with the destructive force of the Nazi regime. He was a brilliant tactician, but his legacy cannot be separated from the context in which he operated. The very strategies that made him a revered military figure were the same ones used to further the ambitions of a regime that brought immense suffering and destruction to Europe. Rommel's lasting reputation is a paradox. A man of extraordinary talent who fought for a cause that resulted in unimaginable human cost. His brilliance on the battlefield was overshadowed by the larger consequences of the war. Rommel's legacy as a hero is also complicated by his failure to completely distance himself from Hitler and the Nazi regime. While his actions towards the end of the war suggest a man of moral clarity, they come too late to fully redeem his earlier complicity in Nazi crimes. His military genius is undeniable, but it must be understood in the context of his role in a war fought by a regime that sought to reshape the world through violence and terror. Rommel's story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the greatest of military minds can be ensnared by the moral compromises of war. In the end, Rommel's legacy remains both celebrated and controversial. He is remembered as one of the greatest military minds of the 20th century, yet his association with the Nazi regime will forever cloud his reputation. He was a man who straddled two worlds, the world of military honor and the world of Nazi ideology. His legacy is one of contradiction, brilliance overshadowed by the dark history of the war he fought in. Still, his impact on military strategy remains undeniable, and his name continues to be spoken with respect by those who study warfare. Erwin Rommel's life stands as a testament to the complex web of duty, loyalty, and morality in the face of totalitarianism. He was a soldier, first and foremost, sworn to protect his country. Yet, as the war progressed, Rommel found himself trapped in a moral maze. He was bound by duty to Germany, but repelled by the horrors of Nazi ideology and its atrocities. Rommel's choices reflect the broader struggle that many faced during wartime, a struggle between loyalty to one's nation and the recognition of the moral cost of supporting a corrupt and brutal regime. The more Rommel witnessed, the more he realized that his loyalty to Germany could no longer be tied to the leadership of Adolf Hitler. Rommel's decision to participate in the resistance against Hitler speaks volumes about his internal conflict. His actions cannot be reduced to simply a soldier's desire to preserve his honor. They represent a broader moral struggle. He was caught between duty to his soldiers, duty to his country, and the profound ethical dilemma posed by the atrocities being committed under Hitler's rule. Rommel's reluctance to fully break from the Nazi regime, however, complicates the narrative. His hesitation to denounce Hitler or leave the military until the war was nearly lost suggests that his moral awakening came too late. The struggle between what Rommel believed was his duty and the ever-worsening realities of the war is a reflection of the deep moral confusion faced by many during this time. Throughout his life, Rommel struggled with the idea that his duty to Germany had somehow become entangled with supporting the darkest aspects of the regime. He had sworn to defend his country, but as the war progressed, his sense of moral responsibility began to outweigh his commitment to the German military machine. His actions in resisting Hitler, though courageous, were reactive rather than proactive, reflecting the tragic reality of how hard it was for many soldiers to break free from the ideologies they had been trained to support. Rommel's legacy ultimately becomes a symbol of this inner turmoil, a man caught in a war where the lines between right and wrong became increasingly blurred. Rommel's conflict was not only about the war he was fighting, but also about the war within himself. Could a man remain loyal to his country while rejecting the values it was fighting for? Rommel's choices point to the painful realization that, in times of war, loyalty and morality are often at odds. His internal struggle highlights a broader moral dilemma that many faced during World War II: how to serve your country while condemning its leadership. Rommel's ultimate sacrifice shows that, in his view, the cost of loyalty had become too great. He realized that loyalty to a leader who represented destruction and death could no longer justify the suffering that his country and the world endured. Navigating life under a totalitarian regime like the Third Reich posed unique and terrifying challenges, especially for those in positions of power like Rommel. As a high-ranking officer, Rommel was expected to serve the regime without question, but his growing unease with Hitler's policies made this impossible. The deeper Rommel delved into the realities of Nazi rule, the more he saw the gap between the promises of national unity and the brutality that had followed. His internal struggle intensified as the war reached its zenith, with his loyalty to Germany clashing with his disdain for the terror wrought by the Nazis. Rommel's initial admiration for Hitler, rooted in a shared vision for Germany's future, began to unravel as he witnessed the extent of the atrocities being carried out in the name of that vision. The actions of the SS, the cruelty inflicted on civilians, and the horrors of the Holocaust were a betrayal of everything Rommel had once believed. He found himself at a crossroads: continue serving a regime that he could no longer morally support, or risk everything to stand against it. The decision was not easy, and Rommel's reluctance to fully break from Hitler's command speaks to the deeply ingrained sense of duty that soldiers in totalitarian regimes often experience. It's a tragedy that Rommel, like many others, was caught in a moral web so tightly spun that the full consequences of resistance were difficult to foresee. Rommel's participation in the 20th July plot against Hitler shows that, by this point in the war, he had come to the painful conclusion that the only way to save Germany was to remove its leader. Yet, even his involvement in the plot was careful, calculated, and hesitant. He did not take up arms against Hitler directly, instead supporting the resistance from the shadows, aware that failure would lead to devastating consequences. This calculated approach was a reflection of the grim reality of living in a totalitarian regime. Any act of defiance was met with swift and brutal punishment, not only for the individual, but for their families and allies as well. Rommel knew the cost of resistance, but he chose to act anyway, revealing his ultimate moral conviction. Rommel's experience underscores the profound challenges faced by those living under totalitarian regimes. How to navigate between duty and morality, between loyalty to the state and the recognition of the state's fundamental wrongs. The choices he made highlight the difficulty of speaking out against a regime that demanded absolute allegiance, and the personal toll such decisions took on those who were brave enough to resist. Rommel's story serves as a stark reminder of the immense courage required to confront evil from within, even when it comes at a personal cost. In the case of Rommel, the consequences of his resistance were immediate and lethal. He was offered a choice by the regime: face a public trial, be publicly executed, and have his family suffer the same fate, or take his own life. This ultimatum underscores the harsh and unrelenting nature of Nazi power. Rommel's defiance came with a steep price, and the pressure to end his life was not just a personal burden. It was a reflection of the oppressive weight of living under a regime where even the most powerful men were not free from tyranny. Rommel's final days encapsulate the terrifying reality of navigating a totalitarian system. It wasn't just about his personal survival. It was about the survival of his family and his legacy. His decision to end his life was an act of defiance, but it was also an escape from the impossible moral choices forced upon him by the Nazis. His death, though tragic, was a testament to the incredible pressure placed on those who sought to navigate a system where loyalty and morality could never coexist. Rommel's place in history is one of ambiguity, caught between military brilliance and moral complexity. His legacy as a tactician is firmly cemented in the annals of military history. His strategies, particularly in North Africa, are still studied in military academies around the world. Rommel understood the importance of maneuvering, of striking quickly and decisively, often with fewer resources than his enemies. He was a master of battlefield tactics, able to adapt and outmaneuver even superior forces. His strategic genius, especially in the desert campaigns, became a model for modern military commanders. Yet, Rommel's legacy is also tarnished by his association with the Nazi regime. While he may have resisted Hitler in the end, his early complicity in Nazi wars of aggression and his role in advancing the German military's objectives cannot be overlooked. Rommel was a man who struggled with the morality of his actions, but his failure to fully break from the Nazis means that his story cannot be easily categorized as that of a hero or a villain. He stands as a symbol of the moral complexities of wartime, a man who tried to act honorably within a system that demanded absolute loyalty to evil. Rommel's life serves as a reminder of the challenges faced by individuals in times of war, especially when loyalty to one's country is in conflict with personal ethics. He is a symbol of the internal battle many soldiers face, between duty to their nation and their own conscience. Rommel, like many others, was caught in a tragic situation where his loyalty to Germany ultimately led to his moral awakening. But by the time he recognized the necessity of resistance, it was too late. His tragic death speaks to the immense personal cost of such decisions in a world ruled by tyrants. In the broader context of history, Rommel represents the moral struggles of countless individuals during World War II. Soldiers who fought on the wrong side of history, but sought in their own ways to prevent further destruction. His story is a testament to the complexity of human nature in times of war and dictatorship. It is easy to label people as heroes or villains, but Rommel's life shows that the truth is often more complicated, and the choices individuals make are influenced by a range of forces beyond their control. Rommel's place in history is one of both admiration and skepticism. His tactical genius ensures that he will always be remembered as one of the greatest military minds of the 20th century. But his association with the Nazi regime and his eventual involvement in the resistance against Hitler make him a figure who continues to provoke debate. Ultimately, Rommel's legacy challenges us to think critically about the intersection of duty, morality, and loyalty, and the high cost of maintaining personal integrity in times of war. Rommel's life is a paradox, an example of how even the greatest military minds can be torn apart by the moral dilemmas of war. He is remembered both for his brilliance on the battlefield and for his tragic fate, a soldier who was forced to reckon with his conscience in the face of overwhelming darkness. His legacy is one of complexity and contradiction, and it serves as a reminder that history is not simply about right or wrong, but about the choices made by individuals caught in the tides of war.